This video is a sequel to our Anno 1800 Year in Review, which covered the first year of the game's release, including its Season 1 pass. Please check out that video first for a full breakdown of last year's content. Anno 1800's second year of post-release development sees the introduction of 3 new DLCs bundled into the Season 2 pass. In this video we will cover the entirety of this pass and assess each DLC individually and how they improve the Anno 1800 game. The Seat of Power DLC, released in March 2020, allows players to construct a powerful, administrative, yet ornamental seat of government for their heart of the city, providing strong bonuses whilst invoking the Victorian aesthetic of the time period. Bright Harvest DLC, launched in June, introduces mechanics to optimize the game's agricultural industry, which before this hasn't received much interactivity. Finally, the crown jewel of the pass is the Land of Lions DLC, released in October, and sends players on an adventure into the African-inspired continent of Mbesa, featuring a new world theatre, new population tiers, new resources and production chains, and new missions and story content. This is Anno 1800, the Season 2 Pass review. The Seat of Power DLC brings a new building type to the player's session, the Palace. Expensive in monetary and material costs, construction of the palace should only begin in the late game, as it costs a whopping 1 million credits to build and 5,000 credits of maintenance. However, it also provides sizable attractiveness bonuses, as indeed imperial capitals were popular tourist destinations in 19th and 20th century Europe. With a limit of 30 wings, players can customize their palace grounds to their aesthetic liking, as the entire building is modular and can be combined with other existing cosmetic items. As the central seat of government, 5 administrative departments provide powerful bonuses correlating to the attractiveness level of your city. As that increases, more and more reforms are unlocked, where players can choose one of 2 mutually exclusive legal acts. These can pretty much be switched at will, so players can actively adapt individual laws to their long-term goals. When attractiveness reaches 9,000, prestige levels unlock, which further boost these effects. It's an effective system that essentially eliminates most of the grind in the late game, but I feel it is a bit too easy. First of all, I would have liked a more extended building progress similar to the World's Fair Monument, constructing the palace through several stages that each would cost resources, instead of the current ploppable structure right now. Also, much of the lawmaking is instantaneous. To represent the increasing democratization of governments during this time period, I really think there was an opportunity here to add some sort of election or referendum mechanic to gauge your citizens' ideals, perhaps influence them with the current propaganda mechanics. Instead, right now it feels very tyrannical, choosing your own laws and changing them whenever you desire without any real repercussions. Regardless, the Seat of Power DLC definitely fills the empty niche that players have been wanting for some time, a grandiose government or administrative building to build their city around. Although the bonuses and implementation could be considered overpowered and easier to obtain, it nevertheless reduces the late game grind considerably and certainly contributes to an aura of power. This DLC is essentially only relevant in the late game, however. With the insane amount of optimization options for industry in Anno 1800, there is a noticeable lack thereof for the agricultural sector, especially since the onset of electricity brings widespread changes to how you play the game, but without any real differences to the humble farm. Bright Harvest DLC attempts to change that. Firstly, silos can now be attached to provide feed for livestock, doubling productivity in buildings such as pig farms or sheep farms. These silos use up 1 ton of grain per 5 minutes, a very slow rate, so it's not even difficult to maintain, and pretty useful for using up any excess grain. On other continents, silos will consume other easily growable resources such as corn in the New World or teff in the new African-inspired continent of Mbesa. For plant-based farms, the production bonuses are unlocked with engineers during the electrification phase. Here, the players get access to the tractor barn, which increases productivity on the attached farm by 200%. The automation further reduces the workforce needed by 50%. That's a whopping triple increase in production for half the labor. However, there are some conditions. Farms are now forced to increase their yield area by 50%, and tractors need a constant supply of petrol, which is converted from oil in the new fuel station building. Oil is arguably one of the more lucrative resources, but petrol consumption is quite slow to not have too much impact on supply. Furthermore, it adds some more complexity to planning and space management, as the fuel station is yet another building that requires a train connection to deliver oil, and a road connection to deliver the processed petrol to the farms. Regardless, it's impossible to scoff at the insane tripling of production, which reduces the overall space required of agriculture, giving more room to ultimately expand your city. What I like most about this DLC is its relevance in all stages of the game. Silos are available as an optimization method for livestock farms as soon as you have access to grain. And as players unlock electricity and oil, they now have a method to optimize plant farms. This was very much a DLC inspired by community feedback, and resultingly encourages the player to dabble into a bit of complexity to save some space. The creme de la creme of the Season 2 pass is Land of Lions, unequivocally Anno 1800's most ambitious DLC to date. Like previous major expansions, the journey to the new continent Mbessa begins with an expedition. The questline unlocks pretty early on. When you reach a population of 100 artisans, your captain will recommend an expedition to explore the warm and fertile lands beyond the newly opened Kulisma Canal, no doubt a reference to the Suez Canal. The following expedition takes a similar style to the Arctic expedition from the Passage DLC, where players decide on their own route to explore, as they make their way through the exotic Mediterranean, with pit stops into North Africa, the island of Crete, the Egyptian pyramids, and finally into the Red Sea and Eastern Africa. I highly recommend to bring a ship with lots of space and explore as much as possible, as many of these locations trigger their own dilemmas, which can reward some pretty rare museum items. Eventually, players will reach the new section of Mbessa, equatable in location to modern-day Tanzania or Kenya, with its sprawling savanna and warm sunshine. This is one of the most atmospheric and thematic theatres in the game, from the African wildlife to the countless African villages, to the cliffside rock temples, to the majestic imperial palace of Emperor Katima himself. Players will be given his capital island of Tamborimi to start off with, the central and largest island. But keep in mind that you will need other resources on other islands sooner or later, and the AI will colonize this region as soon as the player accepts Tamborimi. In Mbessa, there are two residential tiers, shepherds and elders, not too different from the New World and Arctic theatres. Most of the gameplay is pretty self-explanatory, with few differences. Provide unique resources to attract the workforce and keep them happy with luxuries. The biggest gimmick with this region, however, is its aridness, which prevents players from farming the land unless it is close to a water source. With the introduction of river building slots and an irrigation system, canals can be built to extend this fertile range into the interior of islands. And city planning around canals is paramount, since not only agriculture requires it, but fire stations also, for instance. This will place heavy emphasis on optimizing layouts to maximize the arable land available, so get ready for a lot of trial and error. I really adore this system because it's not too difficult to be obtrusive, but enough of a restriction to get players thinking and experimenting. Without going into too much spoiler territory, the overarching storyline revolves around Emperor Katima, who welcomes the player to establish a modern capital for Mbessa. Over the extensive campaign with several side quests totaling over 40 missions, players will develop Tamborime into Katima's grandiose vision, or choose to side with Sir Archibald Blake and establish the Crown's colonial influence in Mbessa, eventually mediating a compromise between the two factions for the prosperity of all. All the while, the story greatly expands the backstory of Blake, one of the more flamboyant personalities in the game. The storyline is nothing special. The themes and topics explored in this campaign glimpse into a mild study of coexistence and cultural embrace, rather than overtly referencing the dark history during the scramble for Africa. But this DLC is definitely a lot meatier than previous DLCs, probably taking me a solid dozen or so hours to slow play it. Furthermore, the narrative is choice driven, with side missions affecting what ending to the story you get. For instance, there's an entire arc about uniting the tribes of M-Besa under one united empire, making Land of Lions the most sizable story content of all the DLCs released so far. The long campaign is ultimately very rewarding, unlocking the Research Institute and Scholar residences for the Old World. Scholars can be considered a separate tier of residences for the Old World. There is an initial limit of 10 which can be expanded later, each residence housing 120 scholars, so they are also a great way to generate influence through population count. They come with new needs and luxuries such as leather boots and tailored suits, but also require things such as bowler hats and hibiscus tea, so complex trade routes need to be maintained to keep them satisfied. Their main purpose is to passively generate research points, a new resource introduced in this DLC, which can then be spent on the Research Institute, each scholar residence generating 4 points per minute. The Research Institute is the third monument added into Anno 1800 after the base game World's Fair and the Passage DLC Airship Hangar, built in multiple stages, and is an interesting way to utilize your population of engineers and the new scholars once completed. Through donations to science, players can trade in useless items and specialists for research points, a very nice way to get rid of loot bloat instead of selling them off for cash, which becomes quickly irrelevant in the late game. There are 3 activities players can spend their research points on. The Fields of Research identifies cultural items, machines, or specialists, giving the player a choice out of the 3 to identify, making them available to be produced in the item development screen. This method allows the player to create any item or specialist they desire from the game's entire roster. This process plays out sort of like a gacha game, but is a much more forgiving way to obtain items rather than rolling dice at the NPC traders. Furthermore, the DLC adds its own unique roster of items and specialists, such as new zoo animals and museum artifacts themed around the African continent. In the Major Discoveries tab, players can invest a considerable amount of research points, their engineer population, and time to research major projects such as revolutionary concepts, mastering of nature, or production methodology. A minimum of 1,000 and up to 10,000 engineers can be invested to speed up the research process. So this adds incentive to actually keep your engineer population instead of straight upgrading them into investors. These projects include unlocking the advanced coffee roaster, rum distillery, or cotton mill, which replace the ingredients with old world products, eliminating the need to import from the new world and therefore drastically changing the dynamic of the ultra late game. Or unlocking the Great Eastern, a steamship with a whopping 8 cargo slots and 3 item slots, making it the most effective trading and expedition vessel. The Research Institute is very powerful, but unlike the World's Fair, which can be brute forced with resources, research points take a long time to accumulate. Overall, Land of Lions is already choked full of content with its new theatre and campaign. But the main allure is its game-altering rewards, greatly adding dynamism to the endgame. Now players can house scholars, build a separate university district, construct the Research Institute, and unlock a powerful new method of obtaining items and specialists. My main criticism of this DLC is the lack of things to do with M-Besa after exhausting all the content. Even in the Passage DLC with the Arctic Theatre, players can still mine gas as an alternative energy source or build airships to modernize their transport fleet. But with Land of Lions endgame content restricted to the old world, there's no real reason to stay in M-Besa. Seat of Power will appeal to those who wish to construct a magnificent palace as a centerpiece to their city. Its administrative effects are decent but not compulsory, so judgment of this pack is more in line with that of cosmetic DLCs, to be completely honest. At $10 US, it is quite pricey and should be gotten on a sale. Newer players can wait on this since the palace won't be unlocked until the late game anyway. 6 out of 10. Bright Harvest is a lot more essential as it packs crucial features to optimize agriculture, something that will inevitably take up large amounts of space. It is also relevant from the beginning of the game with silos. A steep learning curve for tractors comes later. Besides this, the DLC is quite feature light otherwise, but it is the cheapest one from the Season 2 pass at $7 US. Regardless, highly recommended, 9 out of 10. Land of Lions deserves plaudits for its beautiful rendition of an African theatre, its meaty storyline, but best of all, its exceptional late game content, with the introduction of scholars and a research institute that introduces a fair amount to keep all Annoholics busy. This is unequivocally the best individual Anno 1800 DLC to date, and even though its price is steep at $18 US, it comes highly recommended with a score of 9 out of 10. It was difficult to surpass the Season 1 pass. Judging by all the content introduced, Season 1 pass is probably a slight bit more value for money, as Sunken Treasures and the Passage were already quite feature packed with relevant mechanics. However, Land of Lions carries this entire pass on its shoulders and by itself did live up to the hype and expectation preceding it. The entire pass comes at a price of $25 as did Season 1, and like the previous, justifies its overall price tag. Anno completionists should definitely grab this. Newer players should play through the content of Season 1 first before considering. An overall score of 8 out of 10. Anno 1800's second year has been a blast, and the developers have continued to bring consistently polished and astute content that has defined their post-release development. Listening to community feedback, Season 2 Pass introduces much needed quality of life, optimization, and administrative features that ooze more content and longevity to the endgame. The ambitious Land of Lions is my favourite DLC by far, but with Season 3 recently announced, I can't wait to sink my teeth into next year's content. This was Anno 1800, the Season 2 Pass review. Thanks to these Patreon supporters for making this video possible. If you'd like to see more in-depth analytical reviews, consider subscribing on Patreon for as little as $1 a month.